Hey, how's it going? Hope you're doing well. Today we're going to talk about React Router v6. Most people that have been using the version 5 of React Router are probably wondering, should they upgrade? And if you want a quick answer, I would say that you absolutely should. In this video, we're going to do a quick overview of some of the things that changed from v5 to v6. And maybe we'll even do a little refactor from an example application using React Router v5, and we'll refactor that to use v6 just so you can see what that looks like. Now, the best place to learn about this stuff is actually the reactrouter.com website itself, which you'll see is fairly new. If you go into the documentation, they have 4 sections in here that almost is a pick your own adventure. If you're completely new to React Router, there's a specific guide for that. If you're already familiar with React Router from the previous versions, there's a guide for that, right? So you kind of just pick which way you're coming in from. If you're coming in from v5, they have a specific documentation for upgrading from version 5. They do talk about how they're working on a backwards compatibility API. So if you have a very large application, you probably want to wait for that new API so that you can upgrade incrementally. Otherwise, if you upgrade now, it's not really that big of a change in my opinion. In fact, I'll do a example refactor from v5 to v6 in this video probably. But you'll notice the big change is really, one is that the switch component is no longer a thing. It's replaced by routes, which is sort of the same thing, but it functions fundamentally different behind the scenes. It's able to do much better route matching than just your typical switch. So you'll notice if you previously had something like this, right, where you have a switch within the router and then a couple routes in there, that turns into basically the same thing, except now you have routes instead of switch. And then the route components themselves has a slightly different API, which I'll get into more detail in a little bit here. So that's really the big change in my opinion. And then there's maybe 2 other things. One is that the way links and navigation behaves is a little bit different. So in the past, in v5, you're probably used to building routes like this, where you use, maybe match from use route match, and then you pull out the URL from that and use that to build the rest of your paths for your links and your routes. That's no longer the case in v6. You'll notice that the difference is fundamentally a little bit smarter. You no longer have to do that manual buildup. It kind of just knows that, oh, if the path is me, it's gonna figure out what's the parent routes above that, and it's gonna automatically build the rest of the path for you. So it's fundamentally smarter in my mind. So it's almost really like a simplification. And again, we'll do an example refactor so you can kind of see how exactly you change your current implementation to the new one. There's also the introduction of the new use routes hook, which you'll notice is a way for you to define your routes in a object form, right? Instead of you using the typical components as you've seen with the routes and route components, you instead just configure it like so. I believe this is something that they pulled out of an idea from v3 actually. But coming from v5, you likely haven't been using something like this anyway, so you probably don't have to worry about it unless you were using this React Router config package, which I think is a standalone package to allow you to do something like this. The only other thing that I think you'll need to worry about if you're refactoring is really if you were using history directly before from using the use history hook. In v6, that's no longer an actual thing you can use. Well, it's replaced by use navigate, which is a slightly higher abstraction. But the idea behind it is that navigate is gonna replace anything. Anytime you've been using something like history.push, you'll now use navigate for that instead. And the way navigate works is that it works a lot of the same way as the link component and improvements upon that. Right, in the past, if you also had to build up the URL from the base, from the parent's own URL, you no longer have to do that. Again, it has some of that smartness. I'm not sure if that's a good word for it, but it's a little bit better at figuring out, if I pass a string to this, what is the route that it's supposed to go to. I also highly recommend this overview documentation, which goes into a little bit more detail of some of those new changes. For example, with the route components, a bigger change here is that you now have the ability to just nest routes in the same exact file that you're already on, right? If you know from v5, usually you'd have to move these 3 routes lines 11, 12, and 13, you'd have to move this into an actual separate component that has a switch in it, which would have those nested routes. You can still do that in V6, but now you have the option to also just define them top level so that you can have this view where you see all of your routes if you wanted to, instead of them being separated into various components. URL params are pretty much the same thing. They say that you're using use params that actually already, for the most part, existed in V5. There's a slight difference in the TypeScript definition, but for the most part, it really behaves the exact same way. There's also a slightly new behavior with index routes. So if you remember from V5, usually you'd probably use the exact route to match, just like the exact base path of something. You no longer have that in V6. Instead, if you have a nested route like this, you can just use the index prop, and that kind of acts as so the index prop kind of acts as, it says, hey, I want to match exactly that route and nothing else, the base path of that route, right? So in this case, the slash is just going to render activity. Now, on top of that, you'll also notice that the parent of these nested routes is able to take in an element that wraps all of those nested routes. So in their example here, they have a layout component. So you can think of it pretty much if you have any things that are wrapping all of your nested screens, perhaps maybe like a nav bar or something like that, you can put that into the layout component, and within that layout component, it's going to automatically render the children here based on the matched route. And it does that through this new outlet component. This outlet is basically the placeholder where, depending on what the nested route is, it's going to basically swap it in there. So for example, here, if we're in /invoices, it's going to replace outlet with invoices, right? And then the layout, basically, as you see here, is wrapping whichever that current component is based on the matched route. Now, if you're used to the V5 behavior where you did typically had to move your nested routes into a separate component, perhaps inside a switch, you still can do that if you do /star like this on the route path and then pass in a component. And then within that nested component, the component that you pass into that, you can do another nested routes, right? Kind of like how before you would have a switch in here. Now you just have a route. So it behaves pretty much mostly the same way, right? So that's really the basics of what you need to know. What we're going to do now is actually, let's go back to an example of V5 and let's see if we can quickly refactor that to V6. FYI, you can actually find the old V5 documentation if you're looking for it. If you go to documentation here and then scroll down a little bit, you'll see that the previous versions are down here. So let's click at React Router 4/5 docs, right? So this page is probably familiar for you from the past. Let's go to web. So the nesting example that they have here, I think, is pretty much the best typical setup that you would notice from any V5 React Router app, right? So it has a lot of those nesting switches that I just talked about. So let's open that up in Sandbox. All right, so let's do a quick overview of what's in this previous V5 example, right? So notice that at the top level, they have the links, which actually act as their nav bar at the top here, which allows me to switch between home and topics. And then they have a switch here, which actually renders the content on the bottom half here. Notice that if the route matches the exact slash, like here, it renders the home component, which is just the text home. And then if it's /topics, it renders topics. So pretty simple, right? Now within topics, if that's rendered, you'll notice that it also renders a couple links to go deeper into the nesting. So it allows you to select between these 3 links. And then at the bottom, it switches between what's rendered depending on what you previously clicked on. If you're just on the base /topics, exact /topics, it renders please select a topic. And then if you select any of one of these URLs or links, it changes the topic ID and the topic component is rendered, which just again renders the ID itself. So 2 things to notice here with V5, right, is that the nested routing is in another component, right? And also notice that we're sort of starting to pull out what is the current URL at this point, and then we're sort of building on top of it so that we can build our full URL, right? So this link to / rendering, the URL here in this case is everything up to, / topics, right? And then it just adds in rendering. So this whole thing is a URL. It's almost like you have to build it up, right? All right, so here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna upgrade this to V6 so you can see some of the changes. So within Sandbox here, I can actually just hit this button, I think, to update to the latest, which will be V6. Now, immediately you're gonna notice you're gonna run into errors immediately. So if you have a large application, this might be a little bit painful. That's why I said if you wanna wait for the compatible API that they're supposed to be releasing for V5, you can just wait for that. But for a small app like this, and if your app doesn't really have that much routing, definitely I would suggest just upgrade it right now. So the big thing that we need to switch up here is the switch. So this no longer exists, and if you're using TypeScript, actually it's gonna tell you that it's not in there anymore, but this needs to be routes now. So plural routes with the S. And what we're gonna do is route, link, and use param still exist, so we can keep that. Use route match, however, does not exist anymore, so we'll delete that. So first thing we're gonna do with this refactor is we're gonna find everywhere we're using a switch, and we're gonna change that to be a routes, right? So I'm just gonna change that here at the top level, and then I'll quickly also change the one that's nested within our topics component. So I'll just change this to routes as well. And by the way, again, if you wanted to follow along, right, just do the same thing I did. Go to the all documentation for V5, find the nesting example, and open up the same sandbox, and you can follow along. All right, so let's start fixing sort of the things that changed, right? So I believe that with links, you no longer really need to specify the leading slash unless it literally is just a slash. So this just becomes topics. And then within our first routing definition here, I mentioned that the exact prop is no longer a thing, and this sort of child API is also no longer a thing. Well, at least the child API is reserved for nested routes, not necessarily the component for that route itself. So what you need to do is you need to move this component inside a element prop, right? So the only time you're gonna have children in a route is if you have nested routes. So we should be able to actually just close this out because we're not gonna add anything to the children here. All right, so same thing here for the topics. Move this in there, and we said that exact is no longer a thing. All right, from here, something that we need to sort of change. I believe you can still do this sort of switch between the two routes like this, but notice that similar to how we have the link is now just a slash and a slash of topics, that kind of signals to us that topics is really, if you think about it, nested within slash, right? So you can almost think that this is actually a child of this route, right? I know that's probably a little bit confusing, but let's open this up again and close it like so. That way the route now sort of becomes the child of slash, right? And then the path here can just be topics. So you can kind of think about it as you have more and more nesting, right? You can build the URL by following the path up the tree, right? So this path is really slash topics because it's adding the parent to the child's path. And then what we can actually do here is introduce the path that actually matches the index, which is just slash. And the way to do that is we just use the index prop, and then we're actually going to move this element home into that, because that's really what we're trying to do, right? At the base slash, we're trying to render home. Now you can actually pass in an element to the parent here as well, but we'll talk about that in a little bit, right? So this effectively should be equivalent to what we had before, where we had the two routes that matches the slash, just a slash will print out the home, and then the slash topics will print out the topics page. Now let's scroll down to the topics component. We said that use route match is no longer a thing, so we're gonna get rid of that. And then we no longer need to build up the URL like this with links and routes. So this really just becomes rendering, right? No longer need to provide that slash. We'll update this to be components. And this one should just be props vstate. And again, you don't need to add in the slash topics in there because it's smart enough to figure out what is the parent base path, and it's going to add it to that. So before we move forward here, one thing that you need to remember is if you have a nested routes component, right? So remember we had the top level routes. If you have a nested routes deeper into your component tree, make sure that the parent for this component is actually doing the path of /star. All right, just remember that if you're gonna do a nested routes like this, make sure to use /star so that the matching sort of works correctly, right? So this is gonna match. Basically, we're in /topics, so that means if we just wanted to render something in /topics, what we're gonna do here is index element, and then we're gonna move this h3 in there, and we can just close this out. Now for the topic ID path here, we can just change this to just topic ID. Again, no need to have that leading slash. And make sure to move the child to be the element. All right, and then with this lowest level leaf topic component, use params is still pretty much the same exact thing. We don't really need to do anything with that. There is a slightly different behavior though. If you've been using React Router 5 with TypeScript, you'll notice that the type here is now just a string. So you no longer need to pass in a custom type here for to do this destruction that we have. It actually just already has the type of, you'll notice params key, which is just, your typical just key value pair with strings. All right, so if we take a look at our preview here, and if you're following along with Code Sandbox, you might need to fork and refresh to see all the changes happening, because when you switch from one dependency to the other, it kind of gets hung up at times. But if we take a look at how it behaves now, it should be pretty much the same as before, right? So we should be able to switch between home and topics, right? Remember our improved links as well as our improved routing. All right, so we can switch between home and topics, and the nesting topics, we should be able to still see the please select a topic if we're in the index path of that nested route, right? And we can select any one of these topic IDs, and that's going to trigger this matching of this path, which is going to render the specific topic, right? So if you're going from v5 to v6, that is a huge majority of the refactoring that you need to do, honestly. The only other thing I could think of, like I mentioned, is if you were previously using use history, right? Like you might have been importing use history like this. You now need to change that to be use navigate, which you can then pull in like this into a component use navigate, and then you just use navigate similar to how you probably used history.push before. But again, it has that same sort of smartness with building the paths. So for example, if I add a new button in here, we'll just call it navigate. And if I were to do something like on click, let's do navigate. If I were to just say navigate to something here, what happens? So we're currently in /rendering. Let me expand this a little bit. If I click navigate here, which calls navigate something, it's going to add that to the path, right? It's going to do /rendering /something, right? It automatically builds the entire URL for you so that you don't have to worry about it. Now, if you did need to sort of build it anyways from starting from the top, you can add a leading slash here, and notice how the behavior changes from adding to the path to changing the entire base path to now start with /something, right? So if you're trying to go to a totally different absolute path, you start with /. If you're just trying to navigate and do, add to the path, or you just add in, you just do the string without the slash. You can even do dot dot here. So it kind of works similar to how you might be navigating between directories in the terminal, right? So if you're in slash rendering and you do dot dot, this is actually going to navigate to slash topics, right? So you can use that to render back components, for example, right? So if I go back to rendering again, you can use that to do back, to go back by doing dot dot. And you can also use that to, build up however far back you want to go. So maybe you want to do back twice, right? And that would take me to the home page, right? So you can use that to really build up whatever you think is the correct relative path. So if for some reason you wanted to go back twice up the chain and then also do slash about, right? You can do back and this will go to slash about, right? But realistically, you'd probably just do something like this. But it's good to know about that you can do that sort of relative navigation, which is really cool. And again, the behavior that this is doing is exactly the same, from my understanding, behavior as the toProp and the link component. So really, that's why they introduced this new hook, so that you have the same behavior between the link and the navigation hook, depending on how you're trying to navigate. Now, typically, you'd only really use navigate first. For example, maybe you want to navigate the user after a form submit or something like that. So really, it's on when you want to trigger navigation based on events. So for example, right? So that's really navigation in a nutshell. So from a refactor perspective, really, it's not that bad, right? Let's talk about some of the newer things that is not already in this example. So, well, we talked about earlier how, I'm back in the base component here. We talked about how this sort of parent route that is really the parent of these two nested routes can technically also take in an element, which could be your layout component. So imagine we had a layout component like this. Now, layout is not defined, that's why it's erroring. Let's do a quick definition of layout. So with that in place, notice that it just renders layout. Why is that? Because it doesn't know where to place the children. So this is where the outlet comes in. So make sure to bring in outlet like this from the imports. And then what we're going to do is we're going to render outlet in here. So like I said earlier, outlet sort of becomes the placeholder where the child route is rendered, right? So whatever is the selected child route in here, that underlying component ultimately becomes what is in outlet, right? So whatever is matched is here. So if you're providing this element component at the parent level, the parent route, make sure that you have this outlet component here, right? So, but what is the point of this, right? So we were able to do the same exact routing before without this sort of extra layout component. Well, this is good for, again, anything that is wrapping all of your components, right? So for example, all of these links, right? If you had a nav bar, this doesn't even need to be here anymore, right? Let's clean this up a little bit. So imagine that you had a layout component. You could just have that in here. So now that layout component is always alive in there. And same thing, you could do that for topics in here, because if you think about it, this mini navbar is really a component on its own that is really just wrapping the children. So you could extract that to a different component if you wanted to, or you can just do the same exact thing we're doing here where we're nesting. Now you might be wondering, well, what's the point of that? Well, let's do an example here that might give a little bit more sense to here. So we talked about how you can also nest routes, right? So imagine that we didn't want to move this routing into a separate component. We said that we can actually just nest this top level, right? So what if I wanted to move these? I'm going to cut this, and in our top level routing definition, perhaps I just wanted to nest that in here. So if I have something like this, where those routes that were earlier nested in a separate component, what if I wanted to define them top level like this? Well, in that case, you still need to have the ability to render the stuff that's wrapping these two routes, right? You still want to be able to render these links in the topics. So again, we need to remember to instead replace these routes with an outlet, right? So these sort of mini nav bar is still being provided via the element prop here. And since we're defining the routes top level like this, you actually don't need this slash star anymore. But you'll notice that this should behave exactly the same as before. So we can go to topics, and then we can do that same behavior of changing how it behaves based on what the current URL is, right? So slash topics shows this, and then you pick any one of these and it changes to the current ID, right? So that's the benefit of the parent element, is so that it can provide a layout, sort of a wrapping shell for the children, right? And the rest of this code is pretty much still the same. So really, that's honestly the gist of upgrading the V6 and some of the big changes. There's a bunch more in the documentation as far as new stuff, right? Like there's a couple new hooks in here that you want to read about. There are a couple of things that got removed from V5. Whatever you're using with React Router V5, double check the alternative of that in V6. But like I said, most of it is mostly the same. It's just slightly different, switch to routes, use navigation instead of use history. And then now you have the choice to nest the routes top level or within a deeper component. It's really up to you. So that's from a first impressions perspective, it's just a much more powerful version of V5, hence it's V6. For me, it's more intuitive. The whole stuff about having to build up the URL with use rat match, I never liked that personally, so I really like the changes that they introduced into React Router V6. So, in my opinion, again, it's so much more intuitive. It's a lot more flexible. You can decide to define your routes top level. You can define it in an object using the new hook that I talked about earlier. You can keep it still be separated through nested components like you did in V5. So it really is so much more powerful and flexible so that you can do whatever works for you. All right, guys, that's the end of this video. I don't really think I need to make it any longer than that. If you have any comments, feedback from me, let me know in the comments. Make sure to hit that like if you can. I'd appreciate it. And if you're not subscribed, consider subscribing. I think only 10% or 20% of my viewers, something like that, is subscribed to my channel. So there's a lot of you that watch. If you're getting value, maybe you should just subscribe. I'll be making a lot more videos like this. So make sure to stick around. With that said, guys, thanks for watching. Hope you have a good day. And I'll see you on the next one.